Hey folks, tonight we begin with something a little heavier and a little colder. Not war, not politics, but the quiet, unseen ritual that happens after the final breath. Body washing, a profession as old as death itself. Before funerals, before flowers, before farewells, there is someone who cleans the lifeless, gently, silently. No spotlight, no applause. Just warm water, a damp cloth, and the weight of being the last human touch a person ever receives. So tonight, we're not diving into drama or battles. We're stepping into tiled rooms with flickering lamps, into the quiet hands of those who prepare the dead for their journey, so the living can grieve in peace. But before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, and drop a comment. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always a bit surreal to imagine all of us sharing this moment across the world. Now, dim the lights, settle in, and let's drift together into tonight's gentle descent into history. You walk into the room, no grand entrance, no dramatic music, just a quiet door, a colder air, and that soft tap your shoes make on old tile. The walls are white, but not the kind of white that feels clean, more like the pale hush of silence. There's a faint smell, antiseptic, maybe lavender, maybe something else entirely. And in the middle of the room, the reason you're here, a body, still, covered to the chest with a white sheet. The skin that shows is pale, almost bluish, not cold like ice, but cold like stone that never saw the sun. No one speaks. No one needs to. This is not a moment for words. You reach for your gloves, hands slower than usual. Not because you're scared. Not really. It's more reverence. Because this isn't just a body. It was someone. And somehow, even now, they deserve gentleness. You slide on the gloves. They crinkle, slightly as they fit. You move toward the table. And you hesitate. Not because of fear, but because you realize you are the last person who will touch this body. No more hugs. No more doctor checkups. No last grasp of a familiar hand. Just you. Your hands. And that matters. You start with the face. That's the first point of connection. Not the eyes. They're closed. But the outline of a life. Cheekbones. A chin. A strand of hair that slipped free. You smooth it back. Not because anyone told you to, but because it feels wrong to leave it untucked. The skin is soft in some places, stiff in others. The chill makes it feel like touching memory. Cool. Distant. Half forgotten. You take a cloth. Dip it in the warm water. Steam curls upward. It fogs your vision for half a second. Then you begin. One side of the face, then the other. You wipe. Gently. Like removing the world's residue. Dust. Sweat. Time. You think, maybe, you're not just cleaning skin. You're helping someone leave behind their last moment on earth, whatever it was. Pain, panic, quiet. You work your way down, neck, shoulders, arms. You turn the body slightly, supporting the weight. The muscles don't resist. The silence deepens. At some point, you stop thinking of it as a task. And it becomes something else, a ritual. Not religious, not spiritual, just human. This isn't medical. It's personal. You don't know who they were. A baker, a school teacher, someone forgotten, or someone deeply loved. But somehow, that doesn't change your hands. You treat them like someone you know, because, in a way, you do. We all do. There's a moment near the end, when the face is clean, the arms laid straight, the chest covered again, when you step back. The body looks lighter, not glowing, not holy, just more peaceful than before. And maybe that's the point. You're not here to fix. You're not here to save. You're here to say, it's okay to leave now. Someone stayed long enough to see you off. You remove your gloves, toss them into the bin without a sound. The water in the bowl has cooled. The towel is damp and folded. The room is still. But something in you has shifted. You touched death, and it didn't bite. It waited quietly, let you do your work. And then, in its own way, it thanked you. The room doesn't change. But something about it feels different once the body arrives. It's not big, just wide enough to move around the table without bumping your hip. The walls are tiled, off-white with a few cracks where time has passed quietly. The ceiling hums with the sound of an old ventilation fan. You don't hear it at first, but after a while, it becomes a rhythm, steady, like breath that's still here, even if the person is not. There's a single lamp above the table. It casts a warm yellow glow, not harsh, not clinical. It flickers occasionally, like it's remembering something. The rest of the light comes from a corner bulb, low to the floor, almost apologetic for being on. It makes the room feel softer, like a place where someone might sleep, not where someone is gone. In one corner, a metal sink, a wooden stool, a small cart with folded cloths. Everything clean, everything simple, nothing rushed. The smell is faint, disinfectant, lavender, maybe rosemary. Someone once told you it helps with the lingering. You're not sure if they meant scent or spirit. The floor is cold, even through your shoes. The air, cooler than it needs to be, but not freezing, just enough to keep time still. No one talks here, not because of rules, because silence is the language of this room. If anyone's here with you, a partner, an assistant, they move the same way you do. Slowly, with care. Voices drop. Movements soften. Even the tools rest without clatter. The room holds memory, but not stories. It doesn't ask questions. It just holds space. You begin to notice things, small things, because there's nothing here to distract you. A chip in the tile shaped like a crescent moon. The way the drain gurgles faintly after water's poured. A tiny scratch on the mirror above the sink, as if someone once tried to look at themselves but changed their mind. This isn't a sacred place, but it feels sacred, because it's the last room. The last place this person will ever lie still. The last light that will shine on their skin. The last touch, the last cloth, the last breath of warmth from another living soul. And somehow, the room knows. It doesn't try to comfort. It simply stays still, so you can do what must be done. You move through it slowly, not with dread, not with sadness even, but with a quiet sort of purpose. You open the drawer. You place the towel. You pour the water. Outside this room, the world is loud. Cars, phones, voices that never lower. But here, the silence is complete. You almost wish the world paused this way more often. Because in this room, there is no future, no to-do list, no calendar. Only this moment. Only this presence. Only this quiet goodbye. You've washed your hands. The water was warm, but not too warm. The kind that opens your palms slowly, like they're remembering how to feel. The soap was scentless, the towel coarse and clean. You don't rush, there's no reason to. Nothing moves fast in this room, not even time. The gloves sit beside you, clean, ready. But today, for reasons you don't name, you leave them where they are. It's not rebellion, not drama, just instinct. Some days, the work feels like procedure. Today, it feels like presence. You reach forward with bare hands. The body doesn't resist. It never does. The skin is cool, not cold, not lifeless, just no longer warm. A subtle difference. A quiet absence. You touch the forehead first. That's always where you begin, like checking for a fever that's already passed. Your thumb brushes over the temple, and in that moment, everything becomes smaller. There is no outside world, no clock, no noise, just you and the person in front of you. You wet the cloth, dip, lift, wring. The water drips softly into the basin, its own kind of lullaby. You press the cloth gently to the face. Start from the center, work outward, over the cheeks, beneath the chin, behind the ears. The touch is light, but deliberate. Every motion says what words can't. You are still worthy of care. You move down the neck, across the collarbone, along the arms. You lift the hands, soft, slack, familiar in their quietness. You clean each finger as though you're untying knots from a life once lived. You wonder what they held, what they let go of. The silence deepens. Your breathing slows to match the rhythm of your work. The body shifts slightly as you turn it, not with effort, but with gravity's quiet permission. You support the shoulders, the back. You wash what no one else will see. You clean the places no one else will touch. And as you do, something changes. It's no longer just washing. It becomes a ritual, not religious, not rehearsed, just sacred in its simplicity. You don't hurry. You don't hesitate. You just move, like your hands remember something older than instruction. A part of you wants to speak, to fill the air, but silence has already taken its place, and you respect it. You dry the body slowly, patting, not wiping. The towel absorbs more than moisture. It collects memory, finality, grace. You smooth the hair, finger comb strands into place. You adjust the angle of the jaw, close the mouth gently if needed. There's no fear in these gestures, no discomfort. Just care, offered freely. When everything is clean, you step back. Not far, just enough to see the whole. You look at the person one last time, not with analysis, not with judgment, but with acknowledgement. Here is someone who once laughed, someone who once argued, someone who once stood where you now stand. And now, they don't. You place a clean sheet across their body, fold the corners at the feet, tuck the fabric beneath the shoulders. You make sure the lines are smooth, that everything rests exactly as it should. You don't do this because someone told you to. You do it because no one else will. And that is the beginning of goodbye. There's a moment when cleaning ends and preparation begins. They're not the same thing. Cleaning is about removing. Preparation is about offering. Something final. Something human. You reach for the comb. It's simple, plastic, teeth slightly bent, handle worn smooth from use. But in your hand, it becomes something more. A quiet tool for dignity. You start with the hair. It tangles easily. Death doesn't freeze it in place. You hold the head gently, brushing from crown to nape, careful not to pull. If a strand falls out, you place it aside. Never leave it across the cheek, like a careless afterthought. Next, the face. You check for missed spots. A smudge near the nose. A bit of dried skin near the mouth. You wet a clean cloth. One more wipe. Slow, intentional. Then the hands. Fingernails. Clean, trimmed. You slide a thin balm over the knuckles. They've gone pale, but the gesture isn't about appearance. It's about care. As if someone, somewhere, will see these hands one last time and know they were not forgotten. You choose the clothing carefully. Sometimes a family brings it. A favorite shirt. A dress folded with shaking hands. Sometimes you provide it yourself. Soft fabric. Nothing flashy. Just clean. Just whole. You slip one arm through a sleeve. Then the other. You button slowly. The chest doesn't rise or fall, but you still pause between each button, as if syncing your breath with theirs. The pants are trickier. You lift gently, work them up, smooth out the creases. Socks, too. Yes, socks. No one wants to feel cold, not even now. And if there's a belt or necklace or pin the family asks to include, you handle it like treasure, not expensive treasure. Emotional treasure. The kind made of memories. Sometimes, the clothes don't fit perfectly. Bodies change. Time changes them. You adjust discreetly. Tuck where needed. Pin if necessary. Not to make them beautiful, but to make them complete. You sit for a moment, then look again. Hair combed, face clean, clothes neat, hands folded. This isn't performance. No one applauds. But if someone does come later, family, friend, stranger, and they see the body for just a moment, they will see care. And that's everything. You think of nurses, doctors, caretakers, how they work with precision. You do the same. But you also do more. You straighten a collar, adjust a cuff, tuck a wisp of hair behind the ear. Not because it's part of the job, but because it feels like something a sister might do. or a son, or a husband. For a few minutes, you become everyone they've ever loved. Not in memory, not in history, but in gesture. And when you finally step back, you don't see a corpse. You see someone ready, dressed, cared for, at rest. And you feel, quietly, that maybe the last thing a person receives doesn't have to be medical. It can be love, shaped into action. You try not to make it personal, but sometimes the body tells you everything before you even begin. A scar on the forehead, a wedding ring worn thin, a tattoo just above the wrist that says, always. You don't ask who or why. You don't need to. The body carries its own biography. The elderly man with calloused hands and fingernails, stained from soil. Maybe a gardener. Maybe just someone who never stopped working with his hands. You notice the faint outline of a watch that hasn't been worn in years. Skin remembers pressure long after the object is gone. Or the young woman with short hair, trimmed unevenly at the back, like someone else cut it for her. Hospital hair. A final haircut. Maybe. Her shirt smells faintly of jasmine and antiseptic. She still looks like someone waiting for spring. Sometimes it's harder. A teenager. Still growing. The body long, the face not yet set. A bruise on the collarbone, healing but visible. You comb his hair like you would for your own brother, or son, or friend. You don't always know how they died. You're not told. And if you are, you don't always want to know. But the body leaves hints. The man with the broken nose and tattooed knuckles, missing 3 teeth. The girl with the ribbon around her ankle, and a hospital tag still loosely tied. The person whose face is half covered in bandages, whom you dress as carefully as the rest, because dignity doesn't depend on wholeness. Some come dressed already. A suit jacket, a favorite scarf, a uniform from years ago. You undo buttons with care, like you're peeling away layers of memory. Others arrive with nothing. A blanket, a note, sometimes not even a name, but they all tell stories, not in words. In the way the skin folds at the corners of the eyes, in the curve of the spine, in the old fracture that healed wrong, in the wedding band, still clinging to the finger that no longer moves. You begin to recognize things, the heavy lungs of a smoker, the fingers of a pianist, the knees of a runner. You never guess, you never assume, but you learn to listen with your hands. Every wrinkle is a laugh, a worry, a year. Every scar is a survival. And some come with nothing visible. No marks, no hints. But even in that, there's a kind of story. Maybe they lived quietly, or maybe they kept their pain somewhere no one could see. You don't speak to them, but sometimes you whisper, thank you, for holding on, for arriving here, for allowing your hands to be the last to offer kindness. You finish your work, straighten the fabric, fold the arms, and as you cover the face, you think, some stories were never written, but you held them anyway. And in that moment, they were not forgotten. There are no words in this room, no greetings, no instructions, no explanations, only quiet and the sound of water, not rushing, not echoing, just soft drips and gentle ripples. The basin breathes when you move. The cloth whispers as it glides across skin. This is how you work, not with music, not with chatter, but with stillness. Not everyone understands silence. They think it's emptiness, a void, an absence. But in this room, silence is everything. It holds the space together. It carries the weight. It listens when nothing else can. You move slowly, not because you're tired, but because the moment deserves it. The hands remember what to do. You've done this before, hundreds of times, but it never becomes automatic, because each body is different. Each farewell, unique. Each silence, personal. There's a rhythm to it. You wash. You dry. You adjust. You dress. Each step measured, deliberate, as if the air itself might shatter if you move too fast. There are no prayers spoken aloud, no incense burned, but still, the work begins to feel like worship, not to any god, not to any doctrine, but to the moment, to the person, to the very act of care. You don't light candles. You don't chant. But your hands say everything. You are here. You matter. I am with you now. Even without words. Something sacred unfolds. You fold a towel like folding a blessing. You brush the hair like brushing memory. You close the eyes, not out of habit, but out of tenderness. Silence sharpens your senses. You hear the drip from the faucet. You notice how the cloth cools in your hands. You feel your own breath, slow and steady, matching the rhythm of the room. You hear the hum of the lights, the faint creak of the stool, the soft shuffle of your shoes on the tile. Every sound is small, every motion meaningful. There's no audience, no instruction manual, no applause. But that's why it matters. Because what you do here, this quiet, repetitive, careful work, becomes more than routine. It becomes presence. You're not fixing anything. You're not saving anyone. But you're not walking away either. You're staying. You're honoring. You're saying goodbye. The only way you know how. Gently, slowly, silently. And the silence? It doesn't judge. It doesn't ask. It simply holds. It wraps around your movements, so that every fold of cloth and every turn of the body feels like something sacred. You're not religious, but sometimes your hands believe in something your mind doesn't have words for. Maybe this is what prayer looks like. When no one's watching, when no one expects it, when it's just one person caring for another at the end of the line. And when it's done, when the body is dressed, the room reset, the basin drained, you pause, just for a moment, not to speak, not to think, just to feel. Because silence has carried you this far, and it deserves to end with stillness. So you place your hands together, not as a gesture, but as instinct. You close the door softly, the sound barely louder than breath. And as the room settles back into silence, you know, not all prayers are spoken. Some are simply done. They don't look like much. A comb, a dull razor, a chipped basin, a cloth so thin you could read through it, a wooden stool that creaks when you shift your weight. These are not instruments of grandeur. They are not sharp, not gleaming. They do not shine beneath surgical lights or rest in velvet-lined drawers. But they matter. Here, in this quiet room, they become sacred by use. You pick up the razor. It's nothing special. Plastic handle, blade slightly rusted at the edge. Still, you clean it with care. You hold it like you're about to shave the face of a sleeping friend. You move slow, steady, no nicks, no rush. Next, the white cloth. Not pure white anymore, softened to ivory by time and repetition. You fold it neatly, like setting a napkin for a guest who won't speak, but who deserves the gesture all the same. You dip the sponge into the water. It floats, silent, obedient. You squeeze it. The water falls back into the basin like a sigh. And the basin itself, aluminum, dented, one side darker, where heat has scorched the metal. You've used this one for years. It fits your hands just right. Some tools you carry in your pocket, small scissors, a vial of balm, a wooden pin used to close a collar just so. Nothing complicated, nothing flashy, but each has its moment. There's the tiny brush for fingernails. So small, it looks like a child's toy. You scrub gently, lifting away the faint trace of earth, or ink, or time. A jar of powder, scentless, chalky. You dust a little across the neck, behind the ears, inside the sleeves. Not for show, just to absorb the lingering. You take out a needle and thread, unremarkable, common. But in your hands, they close wounds. Not to heal, just to hold things in place, so that when others look, they see calm instead of chaos. Even the towel you drape across the chest, stiff with starch, clean with boiled water, is part of the story. Not decorative, but deliberate. A final covering that says, you mattered. No one sees these things. No one asks about them. They are the forgotten characters in a final act that has no audience. But they are faithful, always ready, always waiting. You clean them after each use. Not because anyone checks, but because they deserve it. Because anything that touches the dead should be treated with the same care. You stack them neatly, hang them to dry, sharpen the scissors, wipe the handles, fold the towels. Quiet rituals, done not out of duty, but devotion. And as you finish, you look at the table, clean now, ready again. And at the tools, simple, ordinary, patient. They'll never be named, never be remembered. But in your hands, they become something holy. Because in this room, even the smallest object has a role in saying goodbye. The dead do not speak, but the living do, sometimes with words, more often with silence, and you learn to listen to both. When someone brings in the body, there's always a moment, one suspended breath, when they hesitate. At the threshold, at the table, at the place where memory becomes reality. They try to be strong, but their hands tremble when they place a shirt on the chair. Their voices break when they say, "This was his favorite," or "She would have wanted this." You say very little. You take what they give: a folded dress, a comb, a pair of shoes with worn soles. You don't ask questions. You don't need to. Grief fills the room before they speak. You feel it in the way they lower their eyes, in how long they stand in the doorway, not quite ready to let go. Sometimes they cry, loud, aching sobs that echo off tile walls. Other times, they don't shed a single tear, just breathe in too deeply, or stare too long at nothing. And then there are those who say nothing at all. They hand you the clothes, look at the body once, and leave. But even in silence, the weight remains. You carry it, gently, not as a burden, but as something sacred. Because you're not just caring for the person who died, you're also caring for the ones they left behind. You feel it when you dress the body. You smooth the fabric not just for the deceased, but for the mother who will see it later, for the son who couldn't make it in time, for the friend who hopes it was done with care. You feel it in the room, in the air itself, thick with all the things left unsaid. The apologies, the memories, the hope that this, at least, might bring a little peace. Sometimes, there's a child, too young to understand. They clutch a stuffed animal, ask if the person is sleeping. No one knows what to say. So they look at you, as if you might have the answer. You don't, but you do know how to be gentle. And sometimes, that's enough. You fold the shirt just so. You place the hands over the chest. You tuck the blanket with the same care someone once gave when this person was born. Because death is not only an ending, it's a reflection of love, of absence, of all that lingers. And your hands, quiet as they are, become a bridge between sorrow and grace, between the unbearable and the understood. You may never meet the family again. They may never thank you. They may never even know your name. But they will remember how their loved one looked, how peaceful, how still, how cared for, and they will carry that with them into the heavy days that follow. So you keep going, quietly, carefully, tenderly, because the work is not just about the dead. It's about the living and the healing that begins. In your silence, you lift them with both arms. They're so light, you barely feel the weight, and yet it's the heaviest thing you've ever carried. The body fits easily on the table, too easily. A space that usually feels just big enough now feels enormous, echoing with absence. You unfold a blanket, not because it's needed, but because it feels wrong not to. It's soft, decorated with faded stars. You imagine it once meant something. There's a tiny shirt, a single sock, still clinging to one foot, a ribbon in their hair, still tied. You move slowly, not out of fear, but reverence. Your hands, so used to strength, now adjust to delicacy. You begin with the face, round cheeks, closed eyes, still, the kind of stillness that should never belong to someone so small. You wipe gently, a cloth across the forehead, behind the ears, over the tiny hands curled at the edge of the sheet. You clean beneath the fingernails, even though they are already perfect. You notice the details. A faint bruise on the knee, a patch of glitter on the arm, like they had been painting, or playing. You don't brush it off. You leave it, because it belonged to them. Because even now, it feels alive. You dress them in fresh clothes, a soft onesie with a faded pattern, socks that don't quite match, a small knit cap, slightly too large. Each snap of a button feels like a line in a lullaby. Each fold of fabric like tucking them in for a final nap. There are no parents in the hallway. Not today. Sometimes they can't come. Sometimes it's too much. But their grief still reaches the room. It clings to the air. It waits in the corners. It settles on your shoulders until your own breath slows. Under the weight of what is not being said, you pause longer than usual, not because you don't know what to do, but because nothing feels like enough. This wasn't supposed to happen. Children aren't meant for this room. This room is too quiet, for the sound of toys, too clean, for scraped knees and finger paint. And yet, you stay. You finish dressing them. You tuck the blanket around their sides. You smooth their hair with the edge of your finger. A gesture no one will see, but one that matters to you. Because even in death, children deserve gentleness. They deserve to be held, even if only by silence. You sit for a moment beside the table. You say nothing, but inside, everything is louder. You don't cry, not here, but your chest tightens, in that quiet way that grief often does. Slowly, steadily, without permission. Then finally, you stand. You fold the towel. You rinse the basin. You prepare the room for the next goodbye. But something inside you remains with them. A memory, a weight, a whisper of a life that barely began, but still mattered. And when you step outside, you carry no words, only silence, light as cotton, heavy as everything. Some arrive without a name, not because they never had one, but because it's been lost, to time, to circumstance, to someone else's forgetfulness. There's no family waiting in the hallway, no bag of clothes clutched in grief, no letter, no instructions, just a clipboard, a date, a number, and a body wrapped in silence. And still, you care. You prepare the room the same way. You warm the water. You lay out the tools. You fold the towels. Not because anyone is checking, but because the absence of watchers doesn't erase the worth of the one who lies here. Some people believe dignity is earned, that it's something awarded for goodness, status, or legacy. But you know different. Dignity is something you give, freely, especially when no one else is left to offer it. The body is older, bones sharper beneath thin skin, veins visible like faded maps. You wonder how long they lived, how long they were alone. You never ask. No one answers. But you still treat them like someone. You wash them with the same hands, the same water, the same care you give to the beloved and the mourned. You clean the fingernails. You rinse behind the ears. You gently turn the limbs. You take your time, because when there's no one left to witness, time is the last gift you can offer. No one will see how gently you brush their hair. No one will notice that you trimmed the stray thread from the edge of their sleeve. No one will know that you paused before covering their face, just for a moment, because it felt like the right thing to do. But you know, and that is enough. You choose a plain shirt, clean, soft, trousers that fit, socks even, because no one deserves to leave this world cold. You fold the collar. You fasten each button. You smooth the fabric flat over the chest. Press the sleeves into place. Straighten the hem. There is no applause. No one will remember this. But that's not why you do it. You do it because care is not conditional, because worth does not expire, because even the forgotten deserve to be seen, at least once more. Sometimes you imagine the life behind the silence. Did they once have a garden? A radio always playing? A dog that followed them around the block? Did they hum when they cooked? Did they dance when no one was watching? You'll never know. But you still honor the possibility, because everybody tells you something, even if it's only that they were here, and now they are not. You light a candle. No religion, no prayer, just light, because the world is too full of darkness. and someone should offer a little warmth. On the way out, you wipe down the table. You wash your hands. You clean the tools. Fold the towels. Rinse the basin. You take one last look, not to check your work, but to witness what you've done and what they've become. Still, clean, at peace, not celebrated, but not discarded. And as you step outside, closing the door gently behind you, you feel no pride, just stillness, because this isn't about being good, or holy, or heroic. It's about being human, even when no one is watching. Especially then, there's a moment, quiet, still, when everything is done. The body is washed, dressed, at peace. The basin is empty. The towels are folded. The tools cleaned and returned to their place. And for the first time in the process, you stop. You stand in the middle of the room, surrounded by nothing new, and yet everything feels different. Because the presence is still here, somehow, lingering. Not like a ghost, more like the warmth left in a seat after someone stands. You look at the body one more time. Arms folded, collar neat, face calm. The features have softened, as if time has finally let go, as if the body has remembered how to rest. You check everything again, not because you doubt your work, but because you want to make sure they leave whole, even if they arrived broken. You straighten the corners of the sheet. You smooth the hem of the pants. You brush one last thread from the shoulder. These gestures, small, unnoticed, are the last anyone will give, and somehow that makes them everything. Then you step back, and for a moment, there's just stillness. The silence deepens. The fan hums quietly in the ceiling. The light above flickers once, as if unsure whether to stay on. And then it happens. You feel the room, empty. Not because the body is gone, but because something else has left. Something invisible. Something you can't name. It doesn't happen every time. But when it does, you notice. The air changes. The space settles. And suddenly, you're not caring for someone anymore. You're just standing in a room. You light a stick of incense. The smoke rises slowly, twisting into soft shapes that vanish before they touch the ceiling. You don't pray, not in words, but your stillness is enough. You bow your head, not low, just enough. A gesture not of grief, but of thanks, for letting you witness this ending, for trusting your hands, for reminding you, gently, that silence can carry meaning. The door is closed now. There's no need to open it. No rush to leave. You sit on the small stool in the corner. You exhale slowly. The room is clean, calm, sacred, in a way that doesn't ask to be noticed. You remember the first time you stood in this room. How heavy it felt. How unfamiliar. Now, it feels honest, unforgiving, but kind. Because death doesn't hide here. It doesn't disguise itself. It just is. And in that is-ness, you've found something strangely human. You look around once more. The table, the basin, the light, the tools, all exactly where they should be. All waiting for the next name, the next touch, the next final moment. But for now, just emptiness. Not cold, not hollow, just still. You rise, turn off the light. The room darkens slowly, like a breath being held, then released. And as you close the door behind you, you pause for just a second, your hand on the knob, your eyes on the floor. Not to say goodbye, that's already happened, but to acknowledge what remains when everything else is gone. No one really knows what comes next. Some believe in light, some believe in darkness, others imagine fields, rivers, reunion, or rest, and some simply stop believing. But in this room, this small, tiled room, where the living prepare the dead, faith doesn't arrive as a sermon. It doesn't need to. It lingers in quieter places, like the way you light a candle. Not because it changes anything, but because something in you wants there to be light when someone leaves. Or the way you fold the hands over the chest, thumbs just touching. A gesture not from any textbook, just instinct. You're not a priest. You've never studied theology. But standing in this room, day after day, something inside you begins to believe, not in answers, but in presence. You begin to wonder, if there's such a thing as a soul, maybe it doesn't rise with trumpets or descend in smoke. Maybe it just slips out quietly, like breath on a cold day, barely visible, always vanishing. There's a kind of sacredness in that. Some families ask for prayers. Others bring incense, photographs, folded slips of paper with messages written in trembling hands. You watch them place these offerings with care, not to change fate, but to honor it. They don't ask you what you believe, and you don't ask them, because belief, here, doesn't need a voice. It only needs space. So you make it. You pause before covering the face. You adjust the collar one more time. You bow your head, not to a god, but to the mystery. You don't know if anyone hears. But that's not the point. Faith, you've learned, isn't certainty. It's a soft place inside us that hopes, even when it knows better. You've seen it in the mother who whispers a lullaby over her child's body, in the old man who presses a kiss to his wife's forehead and mouths, "Wait for me," in the silence of strangers who bring flowers to no one in particular. You've felt it yourself. Not always, but sometimes, like when you walk into an empty room and feel not alone, or when a breeze moves through a windowless corridor and you look up without knowing why. Maybe it's nothing, maybe it's something. Either way, you treat it with care. You don't need to explain it. You just respond with gentleness, with stillness, with presence. Because if there is something beyond this life, then perhaps kindness becomes the bridge. And if there isn't, then at least someone left this world held by human hands. Sometimes you wonder if your quiet work, done in silence, is a kind of prayer in itself. Not one with words, not even one with belief, but a prayer of motion, of folding sheets, of warming water, of treating the dead like they still matter. And maybe, just maybe, that is enough. You turn off the candle. The smoke curls once, then fades. You open the door, step back into the hallway, and carry nothing with you, except the echo of your own stillness. Not everyone could do this work. It's not loud. It's not glorious. It doesn't make headlines, and it rarely gets noticed. But it matters, because long after the machines go quiet, after the monitors go dark, after the last goodbye has been whispered, someone still has to stay behind. Someone has to prepare the body, to wash the skin, to dress it gently, to say, without words, "You are still worth caring for." And that, perhaps, is one of the purest forms of kindness. It asks for nothing. It offers everything. And it lives in silence. This isn't a job about death. It's a job about what we choose to do when there's no more reward, no more audience, no more expectation. What remains is intention. Every folded sheet, every quiet breath, every pause before covering a face becomes a quiet resistance against indifference. In these small, invisible moments, we say something larger than words ever could, that every life matters, that every ending deserves dignity, that the way we leave this world is as important as the way we entered it. Maybe you'll never stand in that room. Maybe you'll never touch a still hand or dress someone for their final journey. But perhaps now, you'll think of those who do, the quiet caretakers, the ones who give the final kindness, the ones who hold space when everyone else has stepped away. And maybe, when the world feels rushed, or careless, or too loud, you'll remember this kind of silence, and how powerful it can be. Because sometimes, the most human thing we can do is show up, say nothing, and still care. If you were a teenage girl in 19th century Joseon, Korea, your world would have been quiet, predictable, structured like a lacquered jewelry box, with every role carved for you long before you were born. You wouldn't speak much. You wouldn't go far. You would belong to someone, a father, a husband, a house, a name, and that was Min Ja-young. She wasn't born into royalty, no royal blood, no grand palace, no destiny etched in stone, just the daughter of a minor noble family from the countryside, the kind of family with enough status to be respected, but not enough to be remembered. Her father died when she was young. Her mother, strict and devout, raised her quietly. If you met Jia Yong then, you might have forgotten her face. She read books. She stitched embroidery. She followed rules. History would forget her too, if not for the fact that someone needed a queen. In 1866, the Korean throne needed a bride. Not just any bride, but a politically convenient one. King Gojong was only 15. Newly seated on a throne, he wasn't quite ready to rule. Real power, at that point, belonged to his father, the regent Hyungseon Daewongun, a man known for his fierce grip and fiery paranoia. He didn't want a queen who would interfere with his plans. He wanted someone quiet, obedient, easy to ignore. They handed him a list of candidates, noble ladies from powerful families. But powerful families meant political baggage, factions, problems. So, Daewongun chose someone with none of those things. Enter Min Jae-yong. She was 16. Slim, well-mannered, polite. Her family had no strong political allies. She was perfect, because she appeared powerless. On paper, she checked all the boxes. Noble background, good reputation, no parents to interfere. And most importantly, she looked like she could be controlled. They thought she would fade into the background. They were wrong. At her royal wedding, she barely spoke. She bowed. She smiled. But behind her eyes, there was calculation, a quiet flame. While the court believed they were gaining a puppet, they were actually installing a storm. But you wouldn't have known that yet. If you were standing in the royal court that day, watching the teenage bride walk in with her silk sleeves and bowed head, you would have thought she looked small, fragile, forgettable. And you, modern, confident, opinionated you, might think you'd fare better in her shoes. But let's be honest, you wouldn't last a day. The minute you opened your mouth with a strong opinion, silence. The moment you rolled your eyes at the wrong court lady, exile. Forgot to bow deep enough? That's a strike. Got caught reading something subversive, dangerous. Now imagine all of that, but you're surrounded by women who've spent years perfecting the art of subtle war, side eyes, poisoned gossip, allies 1 minute and rivals the next. You're 16, married to a king you barely know, living in a palace that doesn't feel like home, and every hallway has ears. But Min Jae-yong adapted. She didn't fight loudly. She didn't rebel openly. She studied. She learned court politics like a language. And she waited. There's a saying in Joseon palaces, still water runs deep. Min Jae-yong was very still, and very, very deep. She began forging quiet alliances, reading books on strategy and history, listening more than speaking, observing power like a scholar dissects poetry, line by line, meaning by meaning. And slowly, she stopped being invisible. People started whispering. She's smarter than she looks. She remembers everything. She's not as soft as they thought. Still, the regent believed he was in control. After all, she was just the queen. What power could she have? But the thing about queens is, they're not meant to stay on the chessboard. They're meant to move it. And Min Jae-yong was watching, learning, and waiting for the right moment to play. They chose her because they thought she was weak, because she didn't speak loudly, because she didn't come from a powerful house, because she looked easy to discard. But sometimes, the most forgettable girl in the room is the one who sets the room on fire. This was only the beginning. So now, imagine you're Queen Min, 16 years old, wearing 20 pounds of embroidered silk, sitting on a polished floor you're not allowed to scuff, surrounded by people who smile but hope you fail. Sounds luxurious, right? Welcome to the Joseon royal court, where every step is tradition, every word is strategy, and every mistake is a message. You thought being queen meant gowns, gardens, and sipping tea under paper lanterns? Not quite. The royal court wasn't a fairy tale. It was a minefield in a pretty dress. Behind its painted walls, it wasn't peace. It was politics. Silent wars fought with glances, bows, and the way someone chose not to invite you to a tea ceremony. You couldn't raise your voice, but you could raise an eyebrow, and that was often deadlier. And as queen, Min Jae-yong wasn't just the king's wife. She was a young woman dropped into the deepest end of a centuries-old power struggle, one that had already begun long before her wedding night. Let's start with her father-in-law, Regent Hyungseon Daewongun. the real king behind the throne. If the court was a chessboard, he was the player moving the pieces. And Queen Min? He assumed she was just another pawn. But pawns learn. Dae Won-gun didn't trust her. She was too clever, too quiet, not obedient enough. And most importantly, she wasn't his idea of a royal wife. He preferred women who didn't think too much. So he tried to isolate her. No political access, no family connections, no direct influence on the king. He kept her busy with embroidery, etiquette, and ceremonial appearances, the royal version of being put on mute. But Queen Min didn't stay muted. She knew the palace wasn't a sanctuary. It was a contest, a long game, and she would need to learn how to survive inside it, not by breaking rules, but by mastering them. It started small, listening, observing, choosing her words like blades. She learned who was allied with who, which court ladies whispered with which ministers, what kind of silk the king preferred, and when he was most willing to be influenced. She didn't fight Dae Won-gun directly. She understood power wasn't about confrontation. It was about positioning. And then came the ladies of the court. Now, here's the part where most modern minds check out. Ladies of the court, you ask? Sounds fancy. Let me stop you right there. You would not survive a week with them. They weren't just serving tea. They were intelligence operatives in hanbok. Centuries of palace life had turned court women into experts at social warfare. They could destroy reputations with a sigh, shift royal opinion with a single phrase placed in the right ear. And Queen Min? She had to win them over, or at least not be eaten alive. Some women tried to humiliate her, others tried to befriend her. All of them watched her. But instead of flinching, she studied. Instead of gossiping, she memorized. And slowly, she built something far more powerful than beauty or charm. She built respect. Not from everyone, but from enough. Because even in that cold, candlelit palace, Queen Min learned something no one had expected her to understand. Survival wasn't about being liked, it was about being necessary. She began asserting influence over internal court appointments, recommending loyal allies, consulting quietly with scholars, watching the budget, the household staff, the rituals. She wasn't loud. She was everywhere. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't quick, but it was survival, calculated, deliberate, and devastatingly effective. If you were there, you might have missed it. But if you paid close attention, you would have seen the shape of her shadow start to change. It no longer stopped at the women's quarters. It began to stretch toward the king. Because here's the thing. While Dae Won-gun thought his son was a puppet, Queen Min was slowly turning her husband into something else, an ally. They weren't a romantic couple, not in the way movies would write it, but they had something far more dangerous than love, alignment. They had time, and time favors the patient. Eventually, Dae Won-gun's grip would weaken, and when it did, Queen Min would already be standing in the place he had tried to keep her out of. But for now, she waited, behind a calm face, behind perfect etiquette, behind ceremonial silence, because she understood something most people don't. Power doesn't always look like power. Sometimes it looks like survival. And sometimes it looks like a teenage girl bowing deeper than necessary, just long enough for you to lower your guard. There's a moment in every story where the quiet character steps forward. No drum roll, no spotlight, just the slow realization that someone you thought was harmless isn't. Queen Min had spent years studying the palace, its people, its politics, its shadows, and now she was done watching. In most histories, queens stay in the background. They host dinners. They wear jewelry. They smile politely beside men who sign the real documents. But Queen Min was not interested in background roles. She had spent enough time in silence. So she walked into the front lines of politics. And here's the part no one was prepared for. She didn't ask for permission. By the 1870s, King Gojong was gaining confidence. Or rather, Queen Min was giving it to him. Quietly, strategically. She was now his closest advisor, whether the court liked it or not. She started attending royal councils, offering input, reading documents, suggesting appointments. At first, it was subtle, just whispers behind the throne. But soon, people noticed. Policies were shifting, allies were moving, and somehow, without raising her voice, The queen had stepped into the king's shadow and begun casting her own. If you're imagining a modern political coup, stop. This wasn't loud. It wasn't public. It was the kind of power that moved like smoke, through corridors, under doors, around corners. When you noticed it, it was already too late. And she wasn't just playing domestic games. She was watching foreign powers, and they were watching Korea. At this time, Japan was modernizing aggressively. Russia was expanding its reach. Western powers were floating nearby like vultures in pressed suits. Korea, isolated and vulnerable, was a prize everyone wanted to grab, and Queen Min saw it coming. While other court members clung to tradition or denied the growing threat, she did something unthinkable for a Joseon royal woman. She learned diplomacy. She built relationships with Russian envoys, invited Western advisors, read foreign reports, balanced treaties with trembling ink, not out of admiration but survival. She wasn't opening the door to foreigners. She was choosing which wolves she'd rather let inside, because if she didn't, Japan would barge in, and they wouldn't knock. This is the part where modern audiences think, why didn't they all see it? Why didn't they do something? But you have to remember, she was a woman, in a system not built for women. She wasn't supposed to be reading state documents or attending councils or speaking to foreign ministers. And yet, she did. And not once did she wait for approval. That made her dangerous. To conservatives, she was too modern. To Japan, she was too nationalistic. To the regent, she was too influential. To foreign powers, she was unpredictable. And to the people, well, they didn't know what to make of her yet. But they were starting to watch. She began placing her family into government posts. A risky move, but one that gave her a network, a web of loyalists in key offices. It wasn't always popular. It wasn't always clean. But in a game where every man had a sword, she built hers out of paper, signatures, and strategy. And yes, it worked. For a while. But here's the cruel truth of history. The moment a woman rises too high in a world built to keep her small, someone will call it chaos. And chaos, they will say, must be corrected. So the murmurs began. She's controlling the king. She's dividing the court. She's dangerous. Some said she was a schemer, others a manipulator, but very few said the truth. She was competent, more competent than the men she threatened. She was trying to protect Joseon, not by holding on to the past, but by understanding the future, a future filled with steamships and gunboats and flags that didn't care for protocol. But in the eyes of the world, she had committed the greatest crime of all. She had governed, and no one had given her permission. So now, if you're still imagining you'd do better, that you'd stride into court, give a rousing speech, and rally the kingdom like a hero in a drama, allow me to remind you, you wouldn't even be allowed in the room. Queen Min got in. And more than that, she stayed. Without a sword, without an army, just a mind sharp enough to cut through centuries of silence. Power, when not controlled, becomes a threat. Queen Min had crossed a line, not with violence, not with rebellion, but by thinking, by acting, by outmaneuvering. And for a woman in late 19th century Joseon Korea, that alone was revolutionary. And revolutions rarely go unnoticed. Japan noticed. The Meiji government had been watching Korea closely. Not with curiosity, with hunger. Korea was strategically located, rich in resources, and militarily vulnerable. It was the perfect stepping stone for an empire dreaming bigger. But there was a problem. Her, Queen Min, wasn't just a political player. She had become a barrier, a stubborn, intelligent, and frustratingly unpredictable barrier. And if Japan wanted control of Korea, she would need to be dealt with. They had tried diplomacy. It failed. They had tried influence. It didn't work. They had tried installing pro-Japanese advisors. She removed them. So they moved on to the next step, planning. Japan didn't announce its intentions. There were no declarations, no threats, no sabers rattling outside the palace gates. Just silence, cold, calculated, strategic. They sent officials to Seoul, smiling, respectful, curious. They studied the palace, the guards, the routines. They built connections with Korean collaborators, men who were angry, ambitious, or simply afraid. And behind those silk smiles, a plan was growing. You have to understand, this wasn't a war. It wasn't a battlefield. There were no flags or armies. What was coming was something else entirely. An assassination. Not because Queen Min was a soldier, but because she was smarter than most of the ones who wore armor. In Japan's eyes, she was a threat not because she wielded weapons, but because she wielded influence. Influence over the king, over the court, over the country's future. And influence, unchecked, had to be eliminated. What made it more dangerous? She wasn't backing down. She had recently begun strengthening ties with Russia, a powerful counterweight to Japanese ambitions. She invited Russian advisors. She exchanged letters with diplomats. She made it clear Korea would not bow. Japan understood this move for what it was, a warning. But they didn't like being warned. The plan was simple in structure, chilling in execution. Remove her, quietly, brutally, permanently. A quick operation. One night. No trial. No evidence. No trace. But before we get to that night, we need to understand something else. The idea didn't come from a single villain. There was no dark wizard behind a curtain. It was a consensus, a whisper turning into a command. Among politicians, generals, spies, she must be removed. They didn't say murdered. That's not how these things are phrased. They said things like neutralized, stabilized, resolved. The vocabulary of empire is always polite. And while they planned, Queen Min adjusted. She heard the rumors. She sensed the eyes. She saw her name written in strange reports, felt the cold distance in the court's halls. So she changed rooms, changed her attendants, changed her entrances and exits. She knew something was coming. But how do you defend yourself against a ghost? The king, her husband, tried to act. He ordered more guards. He asked questions. But fear had already started to rot the palace from within. The air turned thick with hesitation. Servants looked away. Doors stayed closed too long. No one wanted to be too close to her name. Because power doesn't just attract loyalty. It attracts silence. And in that silence, Japan moved closer. This wasn't a simple plot. It was built on layers, misinformation, betrayal, timing. Japanese agents would disguise themselves. They would enter the palace not as invaders, but as ghosts in uniforms borrowed from the shadows. They would have help, not just from outside, but from inside. Because every system has cracks, and fear always finds them first. Now imagine being her. You feel the walls closing. You don't know when it's coming, only that it is. You walk through your home, and every doorway might be the last. You try to sleep, knowing someone has mapped your floor plan. You try to breathe, knowing someone is rehearsing your death. And still, she does not flee. Because even in her final days, Queen Min wasn't trying to save herself. She was trying to save her country. And that made her even more dangerous. Because there is nothing more threatening to empire than a woman who refuses to disappear. And so, they decided to make her disappear. In medieval Europe, food didn't just fill your stomach, it exposed your status, especially when it came to two things, meat and bread. Let's start with bread. Everyone ate it, but what it looked like told the world who you were. If your bread was white, soft, and warm from a real oven, congratulations. You were either a noble, a monk, or someone who worked in a very well-stocked kitchen. White bread was made from fine flour, sifted multiple times. It was expensive, delicate, and mostly reserved for people who didn't have to lift things for a living. If your bread was brown, dark, dense, or full of bits that crunched back, you were like most people, a peasant. Your bread was made from rye, barley, or whatever grain hadn't spoiled. Sometimes it had filler, mashed beans, ground acorns, even dust from the mill floor. It was heavy, it was chewy, it lasted long because no one wanted to eat it quickly. And yes, it occasionally grew a second crust, mold. And then there was meat, the great divider, the feast or the fantasy. To the upper classes, meat was variety: pork, beef, venison, goose, roasted, spiced, stewed, served on platters the size of your table. with sauces that required ingredients shipped in from far-off lands. They didn't just eat meat, they paraded it. A roasted peacock with its feathers sewn back on. A whole pig stuffed with smaller animals. It was performance, a reminder of power. For everyone else, meat was a whisper, a rumor, a small bone boiled 3 times to stretch its essence into soup. Maybe you got offal, liver, heart, kidney, if the butcher had scraps. Maybe you trapped a rabbit, if no one caught you. Maybe, once a year, your family pooled coins to buy a salty slab of pork belly and then rationed it like treasure. Some peasants never ate meat their entire lives, unless you count rats, which, occasionally, were counted. And still, bread and meat did more than feed. They defined. A noble's table was a theatre. Yours was a board balanced on 2 stones. They wiped their fingers with linen. You wiped yours on your tunic. They discussed land, war, marriage. You discussed whether the cabbage had gone sour again. When visitors arrived, they looked at the bread. They looked at the meat. And they knew. They knew exactly where you stood. So yes, 2 foods, bread and meat. 2 mirrors. You stared into yours every day, chewing slowly, trying not to taste the difference. It happened just before dawn. The night was still, the air unusually dry. A sliver of moon hung quietly over Gyeongbokgung Palace, casting its pale light across rooftops and pavilions. It looked peaceful, but peace, that night, was a costume. The 8th of October, 1895. They came early, before the birds stirred, before the kitchen fires lit, before the first servant poured water for tea. Disguised as royal guards and palace workers, they wore uniforms familiar to the sleepy eyes of the watchmen. Some spoke Korean fluently. Others simply nodded and kept walking. No alarms were raised. They moved through the palace like a shadow drifting underwater, slow, controlled, terrifying in its silence. The real guards didn't stop them. Some were paid off. Some were paralyzed by fear. Some simply looked the other way. It didn't matter. By the time anyone realized what was happening, the intruders were already past the gates. Inside, Queen Min had risen early. She hadn't slept much. She hadn't truly slept in days. Too many rumors. Too many missing faces. Too much silence that felt loaded with things unsaid. She changed rooms again that night, an attempt at evasion. But the palace was a cage, no matter how she rearranged the bars. When the intruders reached the inner court, they split into groups. Some began searching. Some held the exits. Some called her name, not with respect, but like hunters calling to prey they had already cornered. There was shouting, then scuffling, then stillness again. The search narrowed. They found her in the back wing, surrounded by a few loyal attendants. No weapons, no guards, just a queen in white silk, standing quietly, eyes fixed on the men she already knew would not spare her. The accounts from here vary. Some are fragments of witness testimony, some shaped by rumor, some by memory, some perhaps by hope. But here's what most agree on. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She asked them to identify themselves. They didn't answer. Instead, they dragged her out of her chamber, roughly, brutally. Her attendants tried to stop them and were beaten. One woman was killed trying to shield her. They accused her of treason, of sorcery, of corruption, of standing in the way of Japan's rightful influence. But really, she had committed only one unforgivable act. She had ruled. They struck her, stabbed her. Some say she was still alive when they doused her with oil. Then they burned her body in a pine forest behind the palace. No ceremony, no documentation, just flames. The scent of scorched fabric and blood hung in the air long after they left. A few ash-covered bones remained. Not enough for a coffin. It wasn't just murder. It was erasure. The goal wasn't only to end her life, it was to erase her presence, her authority, her memory, her dignity. They threw what was left of her into a nearby well, not as a burial, but as a message. And the message was clear. This is what happens to women who rule without permission. Back inside the palace, no one spoke. The king, Gojong, was paralyzed with shock and fear. The court was frozen. Servants moved like ghosts. Even the birds, they said, were quiet that morning. No one dared light incense. No one dared speak her name. Not aloud. Not yet. Her death was not officially announced. There was no state funeral. No mourning period. The kingdom simply continued. On the surface, but underneath, the rot had begun. Gojong would soon flee to the Russian legation, seeking safety behind embassy walls. Power would shift. So would loyalty. And slowly, inevitably, Korea would begin to unravel. Some say this was the night Joseon truly ended. Not with a war, not with a treaty, but with a door left open and footsteps in the dark. The queen who had once been selected for her silence died without a voice to defend her. But her death, brutal, unjust, unspoken, became louder than any speech she could have given. And as the sun finally rose that morning, warm light falling on palace rooftops stained by nothing visible, the world moved on. But history did not forget. Because even if a life can be stolen, even if a name can be erased, even if a fire can consume every trace of a woman who refused to bow, there will always be someone who remembers what the fire tried to hide. After a death, there are certain rituals. A body is washed, clothes are changed, candles are lit, prayers are said, the world pauses. But none of this happened for Queen Min. There was no national mourning, no ceremony, no procession through the capital streets. There was no tomb, no monument, no royal decree, just a forest, a fire, and a stone well. Her body, or what was left of it, was never retrieved. The ashes were scattered, bones cracked, dignity stripped. The final insult, invisibility. The Queen of Joseon vanished from the palace, and the palace pretended not to notice. No public statement, no punishment, no names given. In place of justice, there was only silence. And in that silence, fear spread. Ministers who once bowed deeply now bowed lower, not out of respect, but out of terror. Courtiers who had whispered warnings now whispered excuses. Even the king, broken, grieving, terrified, withdrew from his throne. Gojong stopped ruling. He stopped deciding, and soon he stopped staying. Fearing for his life, he fled to the Russian legation in Seoul, abandoning the palace entirely. A king in exile, within his own capital, a husband who had lost more than a wife. He had lost control. And perhaps a part of his soul. But no one said that aloud, because saying her name was dangerous. So people stopped saying it, even in private. The palace carried on, in routine, not in spirit. The bells still rang, the meals still cooked, but something vital had gone out. It was as if the heart of Joseon had been removed, quietly, and everyone had agreed not to mention it. People knew. Of course they knew, but they also knew that to grieve too openly was to risk everything. Some lit incense behind closed doors. Others left folded paper at the base of trees. And some just whispered, "She's gone. They killed her. They burned the queen." It wasn't enough, but it was all they could do. And the stone well, hidden, ordinary, half forgotten, became something else. Not a shrine, not officially, but it held a weight. They say people began avoiding it, that even the birds stopped nesting nearby, that some servants refused to walk past it after dusk. It was just a hole in the ground, but everyone knew what it meant. It meant failure. It meant betrayal. It meant fear. The well did not hold water. It held memory. And memory, in a place built on appearance, is always dangerous. Outside the palace, the city shifted. The people had heard whispers. That something had happened to the queen. That foreigners were involved. That no one was punished. They said nothing publicly. They continued working, walking, buying rice, raising children. But the silence changed. It grew heavier, thicker, less like peace, more like grief, pretending not to be grief. Korea had lost its queen. And something else, too. Something harder to name. Perhaps it was the illusion of protection, or the belief in sacred spaces, or the quiet idea that royalty at the very least would be honored in death. But now, they knew. If a queen could be dragged from her chambers, killed, and burned without consequence, then no one was safe. And that knowledge, not shouted, Not printed, not declared, passed through the country like smoke. You couldn't see it, but you could smell it in every policy made out of fear, in every official who bent a little further to foreign pressure, in every decision that began with, "Let's not end up like her." The well remained. No plaque, no name, just a circle of stone, growing moss, slowly swallowed by time and weather and shame. Years would pass before anyone dared memorialize her, decades before her name was printed clearly in textbooks, almost a century before statues were cast and films were made. Because erasure is never just about forgetting. It's about controlling how remembering is allowed. And in the years after her death, remembering Queen Min was risky. So people remembered in fragments. A song, a phrase, a mother telling her daughter, she was brave. The well stayed quiet. But if you stood near it, they said, on certain mornings, when the fog was low and the wind had not yet started, you could still hear something. Not a voice, not a cry, a whisper, just enough to remind you that someone had been there. That once, a girl from the countryside became a queen. That once, a woman stood against empire. And that history, no matter how deeply buried, always finds its breath. Even if it starts at the bottom of a stone well. After the fire was out, there was no rebuilding. Not really. You can fix walls, you can polish floors, you can hang banners, but some things stay broken, even when everything looks the same. The court of Joseon was one of those things. It didn't collapse overnight. It splintered. In meetings, eyes no longer met. In hallways, conversations stopped when footsteps approached. Decisions were made, then quietly reversed. Ministers resigned or vanished. New faces appeared, ones no one trusted. Power, once centralized, began leaking like water through cracked stone. Every official feared being next. Every whisper was a threat. And the king? He was gone, not in body, but in spirit. After the assassination of Queen Min, King Gojong fled to the Russian legation, a heavily guarded building protected by foreign diplomats. It was a symbolic move, a desperate one. He stayed there for over a year, ruled by letter, signed decrees in exile, received court officials behind foreign walls. It was safety. But it wasn't sovereignty. Meanwhile, outside the palace, the people had heard. Not all the details, not the full horror, but enough. They knew something unspeakable had happened, that the queen was gone, that Japan was involved, and that no one, not even the royal family, was safe anymore. And so panic bloomed. Not in riots, not in protests, in something quieter, more lasting. Trust broke. In government, in tradition, in the palace, instability. People began speaking more carefully, trading more cautiously, holding their families a little tighter at night. Something sacred had been violated, and no one could name it out loud. Japan, on the other hand, didn't pause. They moved. Quickly, smoothly, quietly. The assassination had removed their biggest obstacle. Now, they moved into the vacuum. They placed advisors in key posts. They rewrote policies. They steered treaties. They built schools, newspapers, roads, all under the banner of modernization. And some welcomed it. Some said, "This is progress." Some said, "The Queen was in the way." Some said, "It's better than war." But others just stayed quiet, because they knew this wasn't a partnership. It was a takeover, wearing polite gloves. In the countryside, farmers noticed new taxes. In cities, newspapers changed tone. In schools, history lessons began to shift. And little by little, Japan tightened its grip. Not with guns, not yet, but with policies, with influence, with presence. There were still Korean leaders in office, but their strings were increasingly visible. It was a strange kind of occupation. Not declared, not official, but felt. Everywhere. And those who remembered the Queen, the real Queen, knew exactly what this was. She had seen it coming. She had tried to stop it. She had warned them. But now her name was barely spoken. Official histories erased her. Records left her out. Children learned about her only in fragments, if at all. She had been erased. not only in death, but in memory, because remembering her meant remembering what she stood against, and what she was killed for. And forgetting? For some, forgetting felt safer, but not for all. Whispers returned. Stories passed from mothers to daughters. Quiet reverence in rural temples. Unlabeled portraits kept hidden in drawers. The queen was gone, but she had left something behind. A fracture, a warning, and a question. What happens to a country when its defenders are punished and its invaders are rewarded? In the years that followed, Japan's influence became domination. The queen's assassination had been the beginning of something much larger. Not just her end, but the beginning of Korea's occupation. What had started with a quiet intrusion into a palace would soon become decades of colonization. And it started here, with a court too broken to resist, a people too shocked to fight, and an empire that had already written the next chapter. History does not always remember who it should. It remembers the conquerors, the generals, the treaties, the dates, but sometimes it forgets the ones who mattered most. On purpose. After Queen Min was assassinated, a strange thing happened. She disappeared, not just from the palace, not just from life, but from the records. Official documents erased her name. Schoolbooks ignored her. Diplomatic statements never mentioned her. It was as if she had never existed. No portraits were hung, no statues were carved, no dates were honored. For years, even decades, her memory was treated like an inconvenience, because to remember her would mean facing what had happened. And no one wanted to do that. Not the Japanese occupiers, not the Korean officials who had looked away, not the international diplomats who had stayed silent. So the silence continued. For a generation, Queen Min became a ghost, mentioned only in hushed voices, a figure you might hear about from an aging grandmother, a rumor behind palace doors, a name too dangerous to say too loudly. But silence is never permanent. It cracks, it shifts, and eventually, it breaks. It started quietly. A scholar found a letter. A poet wrote a verse. A teacher told a version of the story not found in textbooks. Then the whispers turned into books. The books into plays. The plays into films. The Queen returned, not through royal decree, but through culture, through art, through truth passed hand to hand. People began to ask questions. Why was she killed? Who let it happen? Why did we forget her? And the answers, when they came, were not simple. They were heavy. They were shameful. They were necessary. By the 1960s and 70s, Korea was changing, modernizing, searching for identity after war and occupation. And in that search, people began to reclaim what had been taken. Not just land, not just sovereignty, but memory. Queen Min, once removed from the history books, began to reappear. Academics revisited her life. Writers told her story. Feminist scholars embraced her as a symbol, not just of loss, but of resistance. She became more than a queen. She became an icon, a woman who challenged power, who saw the future clearly, who died for it. And in remembering her, Korea remembered something else. That survival isn't always about staying alive. Sometimes, it's about not disappearing. Her name returned to museums, her image to classrooms, her story to the stage. She was played by actresses, depicted in paintings, studied by students. The well where her body had been discarded. People began to visit, not in protest, but in reverence. Not as tourists, but as witnesses. No longer forgotten, no longer erased. She even gained a new name, one that acknowledged her rank, her voice, her sacrifice. Empress Myeongseong. Her death, once hidden, became a lesson. Her life, once dismissed, became inspiration. For women, she was proof that leadership is possible, even in a world that tries to silence you. For Koreans, she was a daughter, reclaimed, fierce, intelligent, proud. For historians, she was a reminder that what is omitted can be just as powerful as what is told. And still her presence grows. You see her now in murals, in dramas, in novels, in classrooms. Her eyes, once shut forever in violence, now stare from portraits in national museums. Calm, knowing, undefeated. And what of the ones who tried to erase her? They are remembered too, but not kindly. Because history, in the end, has a long memory. Longer than governments. Longer than regimes. Longer than fear. And in that memory, Queen Min found a second life. Not in body, but in truth. She was not just a queen who died. She was a woman who ruled. A strategist. A diplomat. A protector of her country. And she was taken not because she failed, but because she succeeded. Today, her name carries weight. It reminds us what happens when power goes unchecked. It reminds us that silence is a choice, but not always safety. And it reminds us that even when a voice is silenced, the echo can still reach the future. So now, when people say her name, they do not whisper. They say it clearly, with respect, with sorrow, with pride, because Empress Myeongseong is no longer missing. She has been returned to history, not as a victim, but as a symbol of resistance, of memory, of the truth that refused to stay buried. And the well? Still there. But now, it's not just a hole in the ground. It's a monument to what was lost, to what was stolen, and to what, against every effort, found its way back into the light. Some stories don't end when the final chapter is written. They end when people stop telling them. And Empress Myeongseong's story, for a long time, came dangerously close to disappearing. She wasn't supposed to matter, not in the eyes of those who chose her, not in the plans of those who erased her, not in the textbooks that omitted her. To them, she was just one woman, one name, one obstacle. But history is strange. It has a way of remembering the ones who refused to be forgotten. And Empress Myeongseong did not fade. She had no army, no throne left, no grave with her name carved in stone. But she had something else, something harder to kill: conviction. The quiet kind, the kind you carry even when no one listens, the kind that builds itself in whispers, in resistance, in each small act of survival. She lived in a time that told women to stay silent. She chose to speak. She lived in a system that said queens were ornaments. She became a strategist, a diplomat, a voice in the dark. And when that voice grew too loud for those in power, they ended it the only way they knew how: violently, permanently, publicly invisible. But what they didn't understand was this: killing a voice does not end what it carried. It only passes the burden to those who hear the echo. Today, Empress Myeongseong is more than a historical figure. She is a mirror. She reflects what happens when a woman steps outside the role she's given. She reflects the cost of resistance, and she reflects the power of memory. Because no matter how carefully a regime writes its version of history, truth waits, in the margins, in the whispers, in the questions that never stop being asked. Who was she? Why did they fear her? What are we still afraid to say? She is not remembered for her titles. She is remembered for her refusal to be a title alone. A queen, yes, but also a protector, a visionary, a woman who read the storm before it came and tried, with every tool she had, to hold it back. And when she was silenced, the storm came anyway. Her country changed. Her people suffered. Her name vanished. But the silence could not last forever. Because no matter how deep you bury the truth, someone will come looking. And when they do not just find a story. They find a warning. They find a lesson. They find a reason to remember. So here we are. Not in a palace. Not in mourning clothes. Not with incense or ritual. But remembering. Telling the story again. Softly. Slowly. Like it was passed down through generations. Hidden in the folds of time. Because maybe that's what justice looks like. Not revenge. Not monuments. But memory. The kind that lasts. The kind that resists. The kind that, once recovered, never lets go again. And so we remember her not only as the woman they tried to silence, but as the voice they could never kill. You're in a forest. It's cold. You're alone. There's no plumbing, no toilet seat, and certainly no bidet. The ground is damp. The wind bites. And your stomach has made a very unfortunate decision. It's the 9th century. or the 5th, or maybe it's 3000 BCE. Doesn't matter. The one thing that's certain is this: there is no such thing as toilet paper, no charming bear mascot, no soft triple-ply cushion of mercy. You have nature and panic. Today, you might walk into a bathroom without thinking, maybe scroll your phone, maybe light a scented candle. But back then, the bathroom was wherever you decided it was. Behind a tree, over a ditch, beside a crumbling wall. Privacy, optional. Comfort, non-existent. The very idea of wiping, as we know it today, was a luxury not yet invented. Ancient people had to improvise, which meant survival and sanitation depended entirely on creativity and what happened to be within reach. If you were lucky, you had access to leaves. Not all leaves, of course. Some were soft and wide, others were sharp, itchy, and aggressive in ways leaves should never be, but you didn't know that, not until it was too late. And trust me, once it was too late, it was way too late. In other places, there were stones. Yes, smooth stones, pebbles, things you could pick up and use carefully. In the Mediterranean, clay shards were sometimes employed. Elsewhere, seashells. The ancient Greeks used ceramic discs called pessoa. The Romans? They used communal sponges on sticks, rinsed between uses in vinegar or salt water. Shared. Sponges. Shared. Some used sand, others corn cobs. In colder climates, snow was the unfortunate option. Nature, in all its diversity, became the world's first toilet paper aisle. Only without choice or dignity. In India and parts of Asia, water was used, still a common practice today. It was, in fact, one of the more hygienic solutions. But in many parts of the medieval and ancient world, water access was limited, or the concept of washing wasn't part of the cultural hygiene ritual. In Europe, for example, people might go their entire lives without touching water intentionally, unless it was for baptism or rain. There were other methods. A flat piece of wood, wool, bark, a rabbit's fur, even one's own hand. The world was an open restroom, and you had to be resourceful, or you suffered the consequences. And those consequences? Infections, rashes, parasites, or worse. Bacteria didn't care how noble your bloodline was. Kings had servants to do the job for them. The French had a role called groom of the stool, a person tasked with assisting royalty with post-defecation cleanup. It was one of the most intimate and strangely prestigious jobs in court. Because when someone trusts you in their most vulnerable moment, they trust you deeply. Or they just don't want to do it themselves. The problem wasn't just comfort. It was survival. Bad hygiene led to disease, dysentery, cholera, infections. It wasn't just about wiping. It was about how humans could protect themselves from their own biology in a world without tools. And in that world, the concept of toilet paper, clean, white, disposable, affordable, would have seemed like magic or madness. It wasn't until the 6th century in China that something resembling modern toilet paper was recorded, sheets of rice paper, used by the imperial family. But for the rest of the world, the idea didn't catch on until the 19th century, and even then, people hated it at first. Too rough, too expensive, too suspicious. Some preferred newspaper. Others, catalogue pages. Anything but the strange new, hygienic rolls being marketed in pharmacies. Fast forward to today, and toilet paper is something you buy in bulk. You joke about running out. You choose brands based on softness, strength, or how cuddly the mascot looks. You get annoyed when the last person didn't replace the roll. You don't think about how revolutionary it actually is. Because once upon a time, in a world without walls, seats, or flushes, the very idea of cleaning up was a risky adventure. You didn't just worry about comfort, you worried about survival. And sometimes, you just had to clench and hope for the best. So tonight, when you settle in bed, lights low, comforter pulled up, maybe even a podcast playing softly, remember this: you live in an era where toilet paper exists. You have plumbing, soap, privacy, a lock on your bathroom door. That is civilization, that is progress, and that is why you wouldn't last a day. So let's say you're lucky. You've made it past the panic of not having toilet paper. You're in the woods, crouched somewhere vaguely private, and you've spotted it. A tree, big, leafy, green. Salvation. You reach out and pluck a handful of leaves, soft, broad, moisture-absorbing. Nature's tissue, right? Except, not all leaves are created equal. For thousands of years, leaves were one of the most common tools for cleaning up after nature's call. They were free, everywhere, and didn't require a trip to the market or a shared sponge dipped in vinegar. But what seemed like a solution often turned into a lesson. A very itchy, very unpleasant lesson. Some leaves were smooth, gentle, like mullein, commonly called cowboy toilet paper. Others, not so kind, stinging nettles, poison ivy, poison oak, leaves with microscopic hairs that caused rashes, blisters, and burning sensations in places that really didn't need any of that. And in the chaos of the moment, especially if it was night, you weren't exactly pausing to do botanical identification. You grabbed what was there and hoped. If it was bad, you'd find out pretty quickly. And once you did, there wasn't much you could do. No ointment, no antihistamines, just time, pain, and a strong sense of regret. Of course, people who lived in nature long-term learned which plants were safe. They passed that knowledge on. Some cultures even cultivated certain plants near their homes or latrines just for that purpose. But for travelers, invaders, or unlucky time travelers like you, the risk was always there. In some areas, leaves were considered the gold standard. In others, they were a last resort. In the tropical zones, there was more variety: banana leaves, fig leaves, even corn husks. In colder climates, options were fewer, and leaves often froze or turned brittle. Imagine wiping with a frozen leaf. Now imagine several. Some cultures developed elaborate rituals around natural wiping materials. Leaves might be used in combination with water, or ash, or sand. Sometimes they were burned afterward. Sometimes they were left for animals. Sometimes they were just left. And then there was the issue of quantity. 1 leaf? Not enough. 2? Getting there. You needed a bundle. But not too many. Nature didn't supply an endless roll. And if you used the wrong side, the rough side, you were in for another level of discomfort. Remember, these were not soft, quilted, aloe-infused luxury pads. They were leaves, on trees, with lives of their own. Even when they worked, they weren't perfect. They tore. They left behind little bits. They didn't deodorize. And worst of all, if you didn't bury or burn them, they just sat there, green, soggy, and shameful. It's funny to think about now. We take so much for granted. We flush, we forget. But back then, every wipe was a calculated risk. Comfort was rare. Consequences were common. And when things went wrong, they went wrong incredibly fast. Still, for what they were, leaves did the job. They were renewable, biodegradable, locally sourced, as eco-friendly as it gets. In today's terms, they'd probably be sold in fancy packaging as organic cleansing foliage, with names like Verdant Touch or Botany Wipe. But make no mistake, if you were living in the past and you reached for the wrong leaf, you wouldn't just be uncomfortable, you might be incapacitated. The pain, the rash, the lingering regret, all for one wrong grab. And that's why even something as simple as a leaf, something green, soft, innocent, could decide your fate. Because history isn't just battles and kings and monuments. Sometimes it's about what you had to wipe with, and whether or not it ruined your entire week. So next time you sit down on your clean, porcelain throne, surrounded by rolls of carefully engineered tissue, remember the people who came before you, the ones who wiped with leaves, and sometimes didn't get back up. By now, you've survived the forest. The itch of the wrong leaf is fading. You've learned the importance of knowing your plants. But let's say you're no longer in the woods. You've time-traveled again, this time to ancient Rome. Marble columns, togas, public baths, and surprisingly, a fairly organized system for dealing with human waste. The Romans were innovators, architects, engineers. They built aqueducts, sewer systems, and latrines that could seat dozens at once. Public toilets weren't hidden away, they were part of daily life. People gathered there, chatting over the sound of flowing water and echoing bodily functions. For the Romans, relieving yourself was communal. But then comes the question, what did they use to clean up? There were a few options, but the one that gets the most attention, and rightly so, is the seashell. Yes, seashells. Smooth, curved, and hard, they were often used by the upper classes. They weren't just found on the beach, they were cleaned, selected, and sometimes even traded. Because not all shells were the same. Some were flatter, some had better grip, some were simply more decorative, like dinnerware, but for a different end of the body. Using a seashell required finesse. Too much pressure, and you risked a sharp surprise. Too little, and you defeated the purpose. It was a delicate balance between form and function. And of course, this wasn't the only Roman method. The more common option was something called a tersorium, a sponge attached to a stick. It was kept in a bucket of salt water or vinegar. After use, it was rinsed and left in the communal pot, ready for the next person. Yes, communal. A single sponge. Multiple people. Shared, cleaned, reused. To be fair, the vinegar was meant to sanitize, but one can only wonder how thorough that was in practice. You didn't bring your own. You used what was there. Imagine a modern public restroom where everyone shares one cloth. That's the level of intimacy we're talking about. Of course, if you were wealthy, you had other options. Soft cloth, wool, or the aforementioned seashells. And not just one, often a collection. They weren't disposable, so they were cleaned and used again, personal seashells. Probably with a servant to manage them. And while today, the idea seems strange, or even horrifying, back then it was normal, expected, practical. Romans were more concerned with sanitation and engineering than softness. They had running water, public sewage, and bathhouses, but what they didn't have was toilet paper. Even their famous plumbing systems weren't connected to personal comfort. The public toilets had no dividers, no privacy. You sat beside someone, made eye contact, talked politics, and then reached for the sponge. It was, in many ways, efficient. But it was also cold. The stone seats were literal stone. In the winter, they were freezing. In the summer, hot and sticky. Some historians suggest people brought fabric to sit on. Others just gritted their teeth and got on with it. And the seashell? While smoother than a leaf and more dignified than a stick, it still wasn't soft. It did the job. That's all it needed to do. Over time, references to seashells as cleaning tools faded. They were replaced by cloth, then paper, then plumbing. But the image has lingered, maybe because it's so unexpected. A symbol of the Roman Empire's strange balance between sophistication and savagery. Because here was a society with heated floors and massive aqueducts, and yet they wiped with something found on the beach. And perhaps that's the lesson. No matter how advanced a civilization becomes, there will always be compromises. Sometimes those compromises are made of marble. Sometimes they're made of shell. So tonight, when you pass your neatly rolled, aloe-infused toilet paper, spare a thought for the Romans, for their ingenuity, for their sponge sticks, and yes, for their seashells. Because in ancient Rome, going to the bathroom wasn't private, it wasn't cushioned, and it definitely wasn't disposable. And that's why you wouldn't last a day. So you've made it through the leaves, you've survived the seashells, you've politely declined the communal Roman sponge. And just when you think it couldn't get more uncomfortable, welcome to the ancient world of stones and wooden scrapers, the go-to options in many parts of Asia, the Middle East, and early Europe. Yes, stones, as in literal rocks, but not just any rocks. People didn't grab the first chunk of granite they saw. These were usually small, smooth river stones, chosen for their shape, texture, and, let's be honest, their ability to not shred your backside. They were easy to find, reusable, and surprisingly effective if you knew what you were doing. In some cultures, people carried personal stones with them, a kind of early sanitation kit, a comfort stone, if you will. In other places, stones were communal, kept near the latrine, and rinsed in nearby water. There was a rhythm to it: use, rinse, repeat. Not luxurious, but practical, quiet, intentional. Then there was wood. Thin pieces of carved bark, flat sticks, sometimes even paddle-shaped scrapers. In Japan, one of the earliest documented tools was the chugi, a thin stick used to scrape rather than wipe, not particularly soft, but efficient. The appeal of these materials was simple. They were durable. Unlike leaves, they didn't tear. Unlike seashells, they didn't slice. And unlike cloth, they didn't need to be washed as often. If you rinsed them in water or wiped them on grass, they were clean enough by ancient standards. But let's not romanticize it too much. Because wiping with a rock, even a smooth one, was still wiping with a rock. There was no softness, no fragrance, no gentle aloe lining. It was cold in winter, sometimes rough in summer. Splinters weren't impossible. Misjudged angles were a constant risk. Wooden tools could warp, crack, or carry splinters. Imagine being in a rush, fumbling in low light, and grabbing the wrong end. Now imagine there's no antiseptic, no gauze, just a sting and the hope that it doesn't get infected. And still, people managed, day after day, generation after generation. They learned to live with discomfort. Or maybe they didn't notice it anymore. Maybe when your entire day involved farming, hunting, or building, a cold stone on bare skin wasn't even in the top 10 list of daily hardships. In some regions, sand was added to the mix. Yes, sand. Used to scrub, absorb, and remove. Rough. Yes, but available. It worked the way pumice works, on dry feet. Now picture that, somewhere else. The philosophy, it seems, was this. The earth provided everything you needed, even if it was unpleasant. You didn't complain. You adapted. Modern people often think of history as brutal, but also simple. But the truth is, hygiene in the past was complicated. People had preferences, rituals, regional methods. What was normal in one culture would be unthinkable in another. And hygiene wasn't just about the physical. There were spiritual beliefs, too. In some traditions, the left hand was used for cleaning, the right for eating, a distinction still respected today in many cultures. In others, water was essential. Dry methods were considered impure. The material mattered. The direction mattered. The intention mattered. But in the places and times where water was scarce and cloth was a luxury, a small, flat rock or a slice of polished wood was enough. Not perfect, but enough. Today, we wouldn't dream of it. We have scented toilet paper in pastel colors, wet wipes, heated seats, bidets that spray from multiple angles with customizable pressure settings. We light candles, play music, scroll our phones. We even rate public bathrooms with apps. We live in an era where hygiene is expected to be clean, private, convenient, even beautiful. But history reminds us, it wasn't always this way. Sometimes, you sat on a log, or squatted behind a bush, and when you were done, you reached for a pebble. So tonight, as you reach for your plush, quilted roll and sigh in relief at indoor plumbing, remember this. 1,000 years ago, someone picked up a stone and quietly carried on. And that's why you wouldn't last a day. By this point in history, people had wiped with leaves, scraped with sticks, and cautiously trusted smooth stones. But nature, endlessly generous, endlessly inconvenient, offered even more options. Not always comfortable, not always safe, but always available. Let's start with horsehair. Yes, literal strands of hair from a horse's tail. In parts of medieval Europe, horsehair was bundled together, tied with twine, and used like a small, scratchy brush. Not soft, but flexible. Not pleasant, but reusable. The idea was simple. If it worked for cleaning boots, maybe it worked for something more personal. Some households kept these bundles hanging in outhouses. Others stored them with farm tools. The line between hygiene and handiwork blurred. It wasn't glamorous. But if you had a horse, you had a wipe. Then, there was straw. Dry, rustling, brittle. Found in every barn, every thatched roof, every pile of livestock bedding. Straw was cheap, disposable, and surprisingly popular as an early single-use hygiene material. People gathered small bundles, twisted them together, and used them once, maybe twice, before discarding them. There was no need to wash, no need to save. Just toss it out the window or into the latrine pit and move on. Straw had obvious drawbacks. It poked. It scratched. It left bits behind. But it was better than bare hands, and it was always nearby. And in winter, when leaves were frozen and cloth was too precious to waste, straw was the practical choice. Not luxurious, not effective, just there. Finally, we have sand. In dry regions, deserts, savannas, places where water was rare and toilet paper hadn't even been imagined, people turned to sand. A handful of fine, warm grains could be used to scrub and absorb. It didn't smear, it didn't rot, it didn't require washing. It was nature's exfoliant, except for your behind. In many desert communities, sand wasn't just an emergency solution, it was the default method. People knew how to do it properly, how to cup the hand, how to brush gently, how to follow up with water or ash, if available. It was a skill passed down, generation to generation. The technique mattered. So did the type of sand. Fine was better. Coarse could leave lasting regrets. Combined with ritual hand-washing and spiritual cleansing, this method actually made sense in its environment. It was hygienic in its own way, but again, not something modern people would accept without protest. Still, across all these methods, horsehair, straw, sand, one thing remained constant. People adapted. They didn't have toilet paper. They didn't have antiseptics. They didn't even have the word hygiene, but they had bodies to clean. And they found a way. In today's world, we expect softness, privacy, and convenience. We want 2-ply, lavender-scented rolls, wrapped in plastic and placed neatly beside porcelain thrones. But for most of history, the question wasn't, what do I prefer? It was simply, what do I have? So next time you walk into your clean bathroom, close the door behind you and sigh with gratitude at a fully stocked toilet roll holder. Remember, somewhere in medieval Europe, a farmer once reached for a fistful of straw, and somewhere else, a traveler in the desert scooped up a handful of sand, and someone, somewhere, brushed gently with the tail of a horse. They didn't enjoy it. They just survived it. And that's why you wouldn't last a day. By now, you've heard of the basics. Leaves, stones, straw, seashells, even horsehair. You've endured splinters, sand, and shared sponges. You've walked through thousands of years of toilet history, and it's already been rough. But humans, in all their resourceful glory, didn't stop there. When nature's options ran out, or when cultural habits called for something different, people reached for whatever they could find. Let's start with sticks. In ancient Japan, people used thin wooden tools called chugi, essentially narrow spatulas designed not for wiping, but for scraping. Neatly shaped, sometimes polished, and occasionally carried on one's person like a personal hygiene utensil. You didn't throw them away, you reused them. And while that might sound uncomfortable, it was. But at the time, it was a normalized part of cleanliness. Smooth wood was preferable to nothing at all. And in Japan's structured, ritual-oriented society, it made sense. Even the messiest human moments had tools of discipline. Next, let's visit Russia, where one tool of choice, especially in rural areas, was the corn cob. Yes, an actual dried cob of corn. Once the kernels were gone, what remained was a firm, ridged, reusable object. In colder regions, where leaves weren't available year-round and cloth was scarce, corn cobs became an oddly practical solution. People kept them by the outhouse. Sometimes, a pile was stacked beside a bench, not for kindling, but for continuity. They were rinsed and reused. Some even claim the cobs were passed down generationally, which is both impressive and horrifying. And then we come to textiles, old fabric, rags, torn clothing. Long before the idea of recycling became trendy, people gave new life to retired shirts, worn-out undergarments, and linens beyond saving. These scraps became cleaning tools for everything, including bathroom use. This was especially common among the poor, or in wartime, when supplies were low. Cloth was cut into small squares, washed after use, sometimes, or burned, if not. In some cases, people had designated rag baskets beside their chamber pots. And if the fabric wasn't soft, too bad. Comfort wasn't the goal. Availability was. Inuit communities in the Arctic had their own methods. With trees and grass in short supply, they used moss, snow, and sometimes even animal skins as cleaning tools. These methods were naturally suited to the cold climate and worked within what was locally available. In parts of Africa, certain tribes used coconut husks or fibrous bark, shredded and softened, to clean themselves. In coastal areas, dried fish skin occasionally made an appearance, soft, flexible, and oddly effective, although it's fair to assume the smell wasn't ideal. In early China, records mention the use of bamboo spatulas, silk scraps, and even rice paper among the elite, a rare early example of something close to modern toilet paper. But for the masses, it was more likely hemp, husks, or just water. In medieval monasteries, monks sometimes used pages from books, old scrolls, failed manuscripts. The irony, of course, being that many ancient texts were lost not to fire, but to function. And finally, there are stories, whether myth or fact, of the truly odd. Feathers, delicate but fragile. Shellfish carapaces. Dried animal tongues. Even baked clay tiles, shaped into smooth-edged ovals. Were all of these widely used? Probably not, but they've been recorded, whispered in footnotes, or pulled from archaeological digs. Each one a small, strange window into how far humans were willing to go to stay clean, or at least cleaner than the alternative. What all these methods share is a simple truth. People always found something. Maybe it wasn't perfect, maybe it hurt, maybe it smelled weird or broke halfway through, but it worked well enough. That's the theme of bathroom history, really, well enough. It didn't need to sparkle. It didn't need 3 layers or a puppy logo. It just needed to get the job done, with whatever was nearby. So, as you sit in the comfort of your well-lit restroom, reaching for your triple-ply, aloe-infused, cloud-soft roll that comes wrapped in perfumed packaging, think of those who came before, the monk with the ruined manuscript, the farmer with his pile of corncobs, the Arctic hunter with moss tucked into his belt. They made it work. But you? You probably wouldn't have lasted the morning. And that's why you wouldn't last a day. By now, you've crawled through fields of straw, scraped with bamboo sticks, and squatted beside Roman sponges. You've seen what the average person endured. But what about the wealthy, the powerful, the royals? Surely they had it better, right? Well, yes, but not by much. In the ancient and medieval worlds, wealth could buy you a lot. Land, servants, gold-threaded robes. But when it came to hygiene, even the richest had to deal with the same human reality as everyone else. Still, there were perks. Let's start with fabric. While the poor relied on leaves or stones, the elite wiped with soft cloths, usually made from linen, wool, or, in rare cases, silk. These weren't disposable. They were washed and reused, often by servants. In noble households, a set of cloths might be rotated like fine dinner napkins. Not exactly convenient, but certainly softer than bark. In medieval castles, lords and ladies might use fine wool rags stored near the chamber pot. These were cleaned regularly, or, more accurately, someone else cleaned them. Because when you're rich, you don't scrub your own wipes. You assign that job to a servant. This brings us to one of the strangest titles in royal service, the groom of the stool. In Tudor England, this was not a joke. The groom of the stool was a real and highly trusted member of the king's household. His job? Assist the monarch with his daily bowel movements. That meant helping him undress, holding the bowl, offering linen cloths, and yes, wiping if needed. Oddly enough, this position came with power. The groom had access to the king during his most private moments, and therefore often gained influence at court. Political secrets were sometimes shared while pants were down. Because where else can you speak freely, if not on the toilet? In ancient China, emperors sometimes used sheets of rice, paper, fragile, smooth, and reserved for the nobility. These weren't mass-produced. They were handmade and used sparingly. It was a privilege to wipe with paper. For most people, it wasn't even an option. In wealthy Roman households, there may have been personal sponges or private toilets, sometimes with running water, but even then, the tools weren't that different. Sponge, vinegar, rinse. Only now, you didn't have to share. That alone was a luxury. In France, during the Renaissance, nobility sometimes used perfumed cloths, lightly scented with lavender or rose water. Some were embroidered, some were monogrammed, because nothing says elegance like custom toilet linens. Still, even with all these privileges, the act itself wasn't exactly elegant. There were no flushing toilets, no plumbing as we know it. Waste was collected in chamber pots and later emptied into cesspits or tossed into the street. In Versailles, the grand palace of kings, there were very few toilets. Most nobles simply relieved themselves in corners, behind curtains, or on staircases. Servants followed them around with pots. The palace may have sparkled in gold, but it didn't smell like roses. Even chairs were adapted for convenience. The close stool, a chair with a hole in the seat and a pot beneath, was a symbol of aristocratic hygiene. You didn't squat like a peasant. You sat like a lord. But perhaps the greatest privilege wasn't the cloth, or the paper, or the scent. It was distance. The rich didn't have to deal with the mess. Someone else did. A servant, a washerwoman, a chamberlain. The tools might have been better, but the real luxury was not needing to touch them at all. Today, we take our privacy for granted. We shut the door. We flush. We light a candle. But in history, the poor wiped with rocks, the rich wiped with linen, and everyone needed help sometimes. So the next time you close your bathroom door and enjoy a few quiet minutes alone, think of the French duke squatting behind a velvet curtain, or the English king whispering state secrets to the man holding the wipe. Because when it comes to toilet history, even the mighty had to go. And that's why you wouldn't last a day. So far, you've learned how people wiped, or tried to. Leaves, stones, seashells, straw, even horsehair. Strange as it all sounds, the real danger didn't come from what they used. It came from what happened when it didn't work. Because hygiene, or the lack of it, was more than just uncomfortable, it was deadly. In a world without toilet paper, soap, or flush toilets, poor sanitation wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a public health crisis. And for most of human history, nobody quite understood why. Let's start with the basics. Infection. Imagine wiping with a rough piece of wood, or a brittle corn husk, or a seashell that hadn't been smoothed enough. A scratch in the wrong place could lead to a cut. A cut could lead to swelling. Swelling could lead to fever. And fever often led to the end. There were no bandages, no antibiotics, no urgent care clinics. Just pain, superstition, and time. If it healed, you were lucky. If it didn't, well, you were part of the statistics no one was tracking. Then there were the parasites. Fleas, lice, and intestinal worms were common in unwashed environments, and because many waste products were dumped near living spaces, into rivers, roads, or fields, contamination was constant. People drank from infected wells, cooked with dirty hands, shared cloths, ate with fingers that hadn't seen soap in days, weeks, or ever. In medieval towns, waste was everywhere. Chamber pots were emptied into alleys, rain washed it into the streets, pigs roamed freely, eating refuse, and where pigs went, disease followed. It's no coincidence that illnesses like dysentery, cholera, and typhoid swept through communities like fire. A single latrine, poorly managed, could infect an entire village. A contaminated river could wipe out a city. And all of it began in the same place, where people went to relieve themselves. Even the clean methods carried risks. Communal sponges, reused cloth, bare hands followed by a quick rinse. Without consistent sanitation, germs spread from one person to the next with surprising ease. The Romans rinsed their sponges in vinegar, which helped a little, but not enough. Odor was a constant reminder. Before plumbing, bathrooms, or whatever passed for them, smelled strongly, permanently. In castles, the stench seeped through stone. In cities, it mixed with smoke, sweat, and animals. Wealthy homes burned herbs to mask it. The poor just got used to it. And because people didn't understand germ theory, they believed bad smells caused disease. They weren't entirely wrong, but the logic was backward. It wasn't the stink itself. It was everything causing it. To cope, people developed rituals. In many cultures, the left hand was used for cleaning, the right for eating, a tradition still respected in parts of the world today. In other places, water and ash were used for purification. Some bathed after every toilet visit, if water allowed. Others avoided water altogether, believing it carried demons or illness. Still, even with these attempts at cleanliness, the results were often grim. The reality is simple. Without proper hygiene, you get sick. You itch, you bleed, you pass infections to others, and when enough people live that way, entire populations suffer. Toilet paper, that soft, quiet roll in your bathroom, changed more than comfort. It changed health. When paired with plumbing, soap, and modern sanitation, it became one of the simplest and most effective ways to prevent disease. But when it first arrived, people resisted. They thought it was unnecessary, strange, even unclean. Only after centuries of suffering did humans realize comfort isn't just about softness. It's about survival. So tonight, if you find yourself annoyed because the toilet paper roll is empty, or because someone left the flap facing the wrong way, just pause. Imagine a time when wiping meant using straw from a barn, rinsing a sponge in vinegar after your neighbor, or hoping that the stone you picked up wasn't too sharp. And then be grateful for paper, for plumbing, and for the privilege of being clean. Because back then, the smallest mistake could ruin your week, or your life. And that's why you wouldn't last a day. After thousands of years of wiping with leaves, stones, straw, corn cobs, cloth, seashells, and sometimes nothing, the world was finally ready for something new. Or so you'd think, because when toilet paper was first introduced, it wasn't met with cheers. It wasn't celebrated. It wasn't even considered useful. It was considered weird. Let's go back to 1857, New York City. A man named Joseph Gaiety had an idea. He was a paper maker and a businessman, and he believed people deserved a better bathroom experience. So he released the world's first commercial toilet paper, soft sheets of medicated paper, sold in stacks, infused with aloe, and marketed as a health product. He called it Gaiety's medicated paper for the water closet. It wasn't cheap, it wasn't in rolls, and people didn't like it. At the time, most Americans used whatever was around: newspaper, catalogs, corn husks, or rag cloth. The Sears Roebuck catalog was especially popular. It was free, durable, and hung conveniently in the outhouse. Why would anyone pay for paper they were just going to throw away? Toilet paper seemed unnecessary and wasteful. In fact, for years, Joseph Gaiety's product flopped. He advertised it as a medical necessity, claiming it could prevent hemorrhoids and irritation, but the public wasn't convinced. The idea of buying paper for personal use felt uncomfortable, almost improper. People didn't want to talk about wiping. They certainly didn't want to spend money on it. It wasn't until 1890, more than 30 years later, that toilet paper as we know it started to take shape. The Scott Paper Company introduced toilet paper on a roll, a new concept, quietly revolutionary. It was easier to use, easier to store, and felt more familiar. Still, people hesitated. You see, even in the late 19th century, bodily functions weren't discussed. Stores didn't want to stock toilet paper because it was seen as indelicate. Shoppers didn't want to ask for it out loud. Some stores kept it hidden behind counters. You had to request it by name, softly, awkwardly, while hoping no one was listening. But slowly, things began to change. Indoor plumbing was spreading. More homes had flush toilets. Cities were growing, and sanitation was improving. And as bathrooms became more private and more modern, toilet paper started to make sense. By the early 1900s, brands like Scott, Northern, and Quilted had entered the market. They worked to rebrand toilet paper as normal, clean, respectable, even elegant. Ads featured soft textures, modern packaging, and wholesome families. The goal? To make wiping seem pleasant. By the 1920s, toilet paper was a growing industry. By the 1940s, it was a household staple. And by the 1950s, it was everywhere, packaged in pastel colors, perfumed with lavender, even embossed with floral patterns. What once felt awkward became essential. But it wasn't always smooth. Early toilet paper wasn't always soft. In fact, it could be rough, splintery, and inconsistent. The phrase, splinter-free, was once a real marketing slogan, because some rolls came with actual wood fragments. Over time, paper improved. 2-ply, 3-ply, quilted, cushioned. Aloe, lotion. Hypoallergenic. The humble toilet paper roll became a high-tech comfort item, engineered for strength, absorbency, and softness. And yet, for something so simple, so essential, it remains quietly mysterious. Few people know who invented it. Fewer still want to talk about it. We buy it in bulk. We hide it in cupboards. We panic when it runs out. And we very rarely consider how radical the idea once was. Because in the grand timeline of human history, toilet paper is brand new. For 99% of our species' existence, it didn't exist. For thousands of years, nobody used it. And when someone finally invented it, almost nobody wanted it. Until, one day, everyone did. Today, we complain if the roll is too thin, too rough, too fast to run out. We compare brands, debate the over or under method. Some even fold the end into triangles, a small nod to elegance in a very undignified situation. But the next time you sit on a warm, quiet toilet, reach for a clean white roll and wipe without worry. Remember that for most of human history, that moment of comfort didn't exist. And even when it finally did, people still said no. And that's why you wouldn't last a day. After 9 parts, countless ancient materials, and far more mentions of horsehair and seashells than anyone expected, we've reached the end. And what have we learned? We've learned that for most of human history, wiping was an act of necessity, not comfort. That innovation came not from luxury, but from desperation. That people used what they had, sticks, stones, straw, even fish skin, and somehow survived. We've seen emperors with silk, monks with manuscripts, and farmers with whatever was lying around. We've watched as sanitation evolved painfully, slowly, often guided by trial, error, and infection. And we've discovered that the modern bathroom, with its soft paper, warm lighting, running water, and privacy, is not a given. It's a miracle. So next time you tear a neat square from a roll, remember, it wasn't always this easy. Someone once had to risk a rash from a leaf. Someone once wiped with a communal sponge. Someone once paid extra for the privilege of paper, and felt guilty for doing so. Toilet paper may be simple, but it represents something profound. Dignity, cleanliness, health, progress. And maybe that's what history teaches best, that the smallest comforts often have the biggest stories behind them. So be thankful, be gentle, and never take that roll for granted. Because honestly, you wouldn't last a day.